The first time I saw that blue tent again, it wasn't in the woods. It was on a computer screen. The drone footage flickered in and out, sunlight glinting off the poles, wind brushing through nothingness, 2,000 feet above Flathead Valley. The tent sat on a ledge so narrow you could barely stand on it. No trail, no rope, no footprints. Just that quiet patch of blue against gray stone waiting 6 years for someone to notice. Tell me where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. I've lived in northwest Montana most of my life. Out here, the air smells like pine sap and wet stone after rain. The towns between Big Fork and Kalispell keep a slow rhythm. Mornings start with the clatter of diner plates, and evenings settle under porch lights that stay on until the last truck passes. Folks know each other by the sound of their engines. Back in 2019, I was still a ranger for Flathead County parks, mostly handling trail permits and school field trips. That summer was long and dry, 80 degrees most afternoons, the kind of season that tempts families into the backcountry for a weekend of fresh air. The Miller family was one of those. Ethan used to stop by my office every spring for maps. He'd bring the girls Lily and June, who'd take turns spinning the big wall globe near the window. Claire would stand in the doorway with that soft smile, patient but ready to get everyone back in the car. They were the sort of people who made the world seem steady teachers, gentle voices, no rush to prove anything. They lived in a cedar-sided house near the edge of Kalispell, close enough to hear the highway but far enough to smell the forest at night. I remember seeing Ethan mowing the lawn most Saturdays, waving when I'd drive by the corner. Claire had a habit of hanging laundry, even when she owned a perfectly good dryer. She said the air made clothes smell honest. When you grow up around these valleys, you learn the land like a relative, where the slopes thin out near the river, which ridges catch the morning light first. The Millers loved that sort of knowing. Ethan once told me he wanted to teach the girls how silence feels out there. He meant the good kind, the kind you find between trees when the world holds still. That last week of August, I ran into them at the hardware store. Ethan was loading propane canisters onto the counter, and June was holding a bright blue tent tag like it was a prize ribbon. Half off, he said, smiling. "Guess where we're headed this weekend?" I told them to check the weather. A small front was moving in from the west, but he just grinned and said, "We'll be home before it hits." They left the next Friday around 4. Neighbors saw them packing the Subaru, the girls singing along to some pop song from the early 2000s. Claire waving one last time as the car turned east toward the Flathead back roads. It was the sort of simple family departure you see 100 times in a summer. No one could have guessed it would become a story people would still whisper about years later. That weekend started like any other. I remember the scent of smoke from backyard grills drifting through town, the low hum of lawnmowers fading into twilight. Saturday afternoon brought clouds that hung heavy over the Swan Range. I kept an eye on them from my porch, thick gray layers stacking above the peaks. Still nothing unusual. Storms pass through here all the time. By Sunday night, the rain came harder, the kind that knocks pine needles loose and slicks the back roads into mirrors. My radio crackled with a few trailhead check-ins, hunters, campers, the usual reports. Nothing about the Millers then. No reason there would have been. They were supposed to be home by Monday morning anyway. Monday came quiet. I remember driving into town under a thin mist windshield wiper squeaking every few seconds. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and pancakes, same as always. Claire usually dropped by the elementary school around 8 to prep her art room, and Ethan's first class started at 9. When neither showed, the secretary called the house. Then the school district. Then me. Maybe they took the long way home, I said at first, still half believing that kind of thing happens, that families stop at a roadside lake, decide to stay one more night under the stars. But by evening, both phones were going straight to voicemail. The first chill of unease settled that night around 9:30. The street outside their house was empty except for the porch light they'd left on motion sensor, steady glow, waiting for footsteps that never came. I remember parking a block away, rain dripping off the brim of my hat, staring at that light through the dark. Everything in me wanted to believe they were fine. Maybe a flat tire, maybe they'd hunkered down till the storm passed. But the woods don't forgive mistakes easily. You spend enough years out there, you feel when something's gone off balance. The night smelled different, wet pine and something colder like the air right before a frost. I drove home, slow windshield fogging despite the defroster, thinking about that blue tent and the way June had held it like treasure at the store. Somewhere out past the Swan River, that same tent was catching rain under a line of darkening clouds. I didn't know then that I'd spend the next few months combing every ridge for a trace of them. I just knew something had gone wrong, and that the porch light on Birch Street burned all night without reason. By Tuesday morning, the worry had settled into something heavier. Calls had gone out to nearby ranger stations and local hospitals. No one had seen the gray Subaru. I remember sitting in my truck outside the sheriff's substation, the rain still drizzling off the hood when the dispatcher read the first bolo over the radio. Family of 4 overdue from weekend camping near Flathead National Forest. The words sounded strange in that quiet room, as if she was announcing a movie rather than a missing family I'd watched drive out of town just 3 days earlier. By noon, we'd mobilized a small team, deputies, volunteers, a few search and rescue regulars like me. We started with the obvious, every pullout, every campground near Swan River. The storm had passed, leaving the roads soft and rutted, and the smell of wet cedar followed us everywhere. We found tire impressions on a dirt service road just beyond mile marker 21, 2 deep ruts that stopped near a clearing. The fire ring there was still warm to the touch. You could see where someone had stacked kindling, maybe cooked breakfast, but there was no tent, no car, no backpacks, nothing. It was like someone had peeled the camp right off the ground. We spent that first night working by headlamp. The air dropped into the 40s, our breaths coming out in white plumes as we swept the tree line. Dogs picked up faint scent trails that vanished near the river. I remember one handler, a quiet woman named Marcy, looking up at me after her bloodhound sat down mid-trail. "It's gone," she said softly, "like they stepped off the earth." The next morning, helicopters came in from Missoula, bright orange bodies cutting across the gray sky. Their rotors threw dust across the valley, and I remember thinking how loud they sounded against all that silence. From above, the landscape looked endless, rolling green ridges, winding streams, 1,000 places to disappear. We mapped every valley, every ravine that could hide a car. By nightfall, nothing. Claire's sister Abby arrived from Bozeman that evening. She stood near the command post with her arms crossed tight against her chest. They wouldn't just keep driving, she told me. They always call if they're running late. I didn't have a good answer. I told her the storm might have knocked out a signal or washed a road, that we'd find them by morning. But I knew the forest better than that. Storm or no storm, a car leaves tracks, and theirs had simply stopped. By Thursday, the operation stretched to 40 people. Volunteers combed creek beds, divers searched the Swan Reservoir, and the news vans showed up by midday antennas unfolding like silver weeds. Reporters asked about foul play, but there was nothing to suggest it. No broken branches, no torn gear, no sign of struggle, just absence. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. A pilot named Lawson flew a thermal sweep that night, infrared cameras scanning for heat signatures. I watched the screen beside him in the cabin, the valleys rolling beneath us in green and black. Once the sensor flashed red and my heart jumped. But it was just a bear moving through the timber. Everything else glowed cold. After a week, people started talking about the water. Maybe they went in one, deputy said. A bridge washout, heavy rain car swept downstream. We dragged the edges of the river with grappling hooks, hoping for something, anything, but all we pulled up were branches and silt. The current was steady and different. When the second week ended, Command called it an extended search. That's the polite phrase for when the odds shift from rescue to recovery. I drove home that night through fog thick enough to blur the road lines. On the dash, the radio murmured static, and for a moment I could almost hear the girls laughing again from that August afternoon. It hit me how young they were, 10 and 7, and how small those sleeping bags would look against the dark. Months went by. Snow came early that year, closing the upper trails. The case faded from the news cycle, replaced by winter headlines, road closures, elk counts, local elections. But their faces stayed taped to the bulletin board in my office. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at those photographs, trying to read something in their smiles, as if an answer were hiding there all along. By the start of 2020, most folks assumed what no one wanted to say out loud, that the Millers had been claimed by the land. It happens more than people think out here. You get turned around a sudden fog, a drop-off hidden under loose pine. The forest doesn't leave many traces once snow covers it. Still, something about this one wouldn't settle. We'd searched those canyons so many times, flown every grid twice over. You don't just miss a car that big. I used to drive out there on quiet Sundays, park near the service road, and just listen. Sometimes the wind through the pines sounds almost like voices if you let it. Life kept moving in Kalispell as it does. Kids grew stores, changed owners, and eventually people stopped mentioning the Millers except in passing. But I couldn't forget them. Maybe it was because I'd seen them that last day, or maybe because there were no goodbyes, no wreckage, no remains, just an unfinished sentence hanging over that valley. 6 years later, when the call came in about a drone sighting, I was long retired. It was early September wildfire season, and a contractor out of Helena had been mapping burn scars east of the river. His footage showed a small blue object halfway down a cliff, nothing remarkable until he zoomed in. I remember the voice on the other end of the line, young and unsure. "Mr. Avery, you might want to see this." He sent me the still frame, grainy, tilted sunlight cutting across stone, and there it was. That same blue tent I'd watched June hold in her arms at the hardware store. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. A training prop, maybe, or debris left by a rescue crew. But when the coordinates came through, my stomach tightened. That ridge was nearly vertical, 2,000 feet up, with no trails anywhere near it. I knew every inch of that terrain. Nobody could have reached that ledge without ropes or a helicopter. 3 days later, a retrieval team was assembled: county deputies, forestry climbers, and Detective Aaron Duvall, who'd reopened the file. I joined as an observer, standing by the base of the ridge while the climbers moved upward. The morning air was cold enough to bite. You could see their harness lines glinting in the light as they neared the ledge. From below, it looked impossibly small, barely enough space for a tent to sit upright. When they reached it, the radio crackled. One of the climbers' voices came through, thin and breathless. "Tent's intact. No damage visible." I held my breath. No sign of anyone. A long pause followed. "Inside looks untouched." Hours later, after they'd lowered the tent by pulley, I walked over as the evidence team unzipped the flap. Dust rose in a small puff. 4 sleeping bags neatly laid out. A camping mug cracked but standing upright. A child's paperback Charlotte's Web, its pages stiff from age. The smell that came out wasn't rot. It was dry old air, like something sealed too long. One deputy lifted a sleeping bag and found a camera battery underneath, still showing charge. I could see the confusion on everyone's faces. 6 Montana winters should have destroyed anything left exposed. Yet the fabric was bright, the stitching firm, like it had been set there yesterday. We cataloged every piece, laid them out on tarps under the fading sun. I stood back, staring at that blue fabric and trying to reconcile the impossible. Nothing about it fit time's logic. 6 years of storms and snow should have shredded it to ribbons. Instead, it looked preserved, almost staged. Detective Duvall crouched beside the tent, tracing a finger along the corner seam. "This was hand-sewn," she murmured. "Look, thread colors off from the factory." She was right. Claire's handiwork. I'd seen it once before when she patched a tear at the school camping fair. When the locket turned up the next day, a small silver heart engraved with the name June. The air went still around us. It had been placed carefully in a triangle of stones just below the ledge, as if meant to be found. I remember Duval holding it in her gloved hand, thumb brushing the tarnished surface. "This wasn't dropped," she said quietly. "It was left." That night none of us slept well. My dreams were full of static and wind, like the forest was trying to speak but couldn't form words. 2 weeks later, the lab called about the tent's rainfly. The manufacturing date stamped inside read April 2021, 2 years after the family vanished. I didn't know what to make of that. None of us did. The official explanation was a misprint, maybe a replacement part. But every other detail matched the miller's original model exactly down to that little hand-sewn repair. Duval reopened the full investigation after that. She wasn't the type to chase ghost stories. She wanted data evidence coordinates. But even she admitted, you don't miss a blue tent on open rock for 6 years. I visited the site one last time before winter. The ridge looked ordinary again, pines swaying light scattering through dust. Yet something in the air felt charged like static before lightning. I stood there listening, half expecting the wind to whisper the same question we'd all been asking. How did that tent get there? When I turned to leave, I caught the faint echo of metal against stone. 3 small taps carried on the breeze. Probably loose gear from the climbers, I told myself. Still, I looked back once more. The ledge was empty now, but the silence had a weight to it, as if the mountain was holding its breath, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And that's where it began again, the long unraveling that would take us deep beneath that ridge, where the ground itself seemed to hum. But that came later. For now, all we knew was that a family who'd vanished without a trace had somehow returned in the form of a tent no one could explain. And standing there, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. Maybe the forest hadn't taken them after all. Maybe something else had been waiting for them out there. And for 6 long years, it had been waiting for us too. The investigation took on a strange rhythm after that, part science, part superstition. Every day we'd drive out to the evidence lot in Helena where the tent was stored, as if standing in that cold fluorescent room might help us understand how it had survived 6 years untouched. Detective Duval had it laid out on a clean white tarp, each piece tagged and photographed. The fabric still smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke, a scent that shouldn't have lasted that long. We'd stand there in silence sometimes, just listening to the hum of the ventilation, both of us trying to make sense of the impossible. It didn't feel like a discovery. It felt like a message we hadn't learned how to read. When the forensics lab called about the camera battery, I could hear the hesitation in the technician's voice. "Still holds charge," he said. "You'll want to see this yourself." I drove down that afternoon, the clouds hanging low over the highway, the kind of gray that makes the world feel closer than it should. The technician met us in a back room filled with screens and humming machines. He slid a small Canon body across the table, a matching model they'd borrowed to test the battery, and attached it like it was any other day on the job. The screen flickered, blinked twice, and then came to life. 2 folders appeared on the display labeled simply Trail. The dates read August 2019. The first photos were harmless. Ethan setting up the tent. Claire smiling near a small stove, the girls crouched by the creek with mud on their knees. It felt wrong watching strangers' happiness through a machine that outlived them. Every click of the arrow key moved us forward in time, shadows, lengthening light fading. Then the pictures changed. The framing grew uneven, the camera tilted up toward the cliffs and trees. There were shots taken in motion, blurred edges, images that looked more like instinct than memory. One frame caught the tent half-zipped, and behind it, something in the corner. A shape, not clear enough to identify, but tall, standing too far from the family to belong to them. No one spoke for a long time. Duval leaned closer, rewinding through the sequence, her finger trembling slightly on the mouse. "That's not Ethan," she said. The figure was broad-shouldered, jacketed face hidden in the blur. Just before the frame cut to black, a sliver of sky appeared the same pale granite ridge where we'd found the tent years later. The timestamps made less sense than the photos. The last image was logged at 6:43 p.m. on August 10th, the same minute Ethan's cell phone had pinged from their base camp almost 30 miles away. 2 places at once, the same device connected to both. The lab ran every test they had, but the data was clean. No tampering, no time zone errors, nothing that could explain it. When the technicians extracted the audio embedded in the corrupted video files, we crowded around a speaker expecting static. Instead, there was a low hum, rhythmic, mechanical, not from the camera itself. It pulsed every few seconds, steady as breath. One of the younger techs said it sounded like an engine running underground. The recording ended with a sharp, hollow knock. It could have been a rock shift, but there was a pause afterward long enough that you could almost imagine someone waiting for an answer. Duval was quiet the entire drive back. She had a habit of writing while she thought notes scribbled on a small pad she kept in her jacket. When we reached the ridge again that week, she stood at the cliff's edge for nearly an hour, just listening. The wind cut through the trees, carrying a faint metallic ring like distant machinery. Then she noticed something half buried at the far end of the ledge, a rusted pipe sticking out of the rock sealed at the top with an old cap. The kind of vent you'd see on mine shafts, except there were no mines listed anywhere near Flathead Valley. That night she requested the old forestry survey maps. The next morning a scanned chart arrived from 1974. In faded pencil, near the same coordinates, was a label, Access Tunnel Number 4 Decommissioned. There was no record of it in any modern database. When the ground team used sonar and thermal sensors along the slope, they picked up hollow pockets beneath the rock, long chambers irregular in shape, spreading outward like roots. We dropped a microphone through the pipe the following week. The sound came almost instantly, a hum so faint it was more felt than heard, low and deliberate pulsing every few seconds. It wasn't an echo. I remember Duval closing her eyes, leaning in, as if the mountain itself were breathing beneath us. Then clear through the static came a single knock. The forestry department called the next day to shut it down. Too unstable, they said. Too expensive to excavate. Officially, the pipe was to be resealed and left alone. But Duval wasn't the kind to walk away from unfinished noise. She reached out to a volunteer caving group out of Missoula folks who mapped old logging tunnels for fun. They came with ground radar, small thermal drones, and the kind of quiet excitement that only people chasing mysteries carry. We hiked in before dawn. The forest felt colder than usual, the air heavier like the weather was waiting for something. The volunteers found a fissure west of the vent, narrow enough that only 2 could fit with harnesses. I stayed above ground, listening to their voices echo through the radio. At about 70 feet, one of them said, "We're hitting metal." A few minutes later, the feed cut to static. When they hauled the line back, the small camera attached to it had captured 2 frames. One of packed dirt, one of something reflective, half buried, a curved shape that looked disturbingly like a door handle. The following week, Duval arranged another probe using a longer optical line lowered directly through the vent. The camera traveled 78 feet before it found concrete, a corner wall, paint peeling from moisture. And then, written in white block letters, the words, "Property of Federal Survey Project, 1973. None of us had ever heard of such a project. A month later, a university archivist reached out to Duval after hearing a local radio report about the case. She'd found an unscanned box of forestry documents in Missoula. Inside was a folded blueprint labeled Survey 734, Soil Vibration Experiment. According to the notes, a network of underground chambers had been built in the 70s to measure seismic activity during logging operations. Each chamber had its own generator and maintenance shaft. The program ended after 3 months because of unexplained interference in the data. Supposedly, everything had been dismantled. That night, Duval played the vent recording again in her office. The hum had changed. It was louder now, almost resonant, and at the end of the clip came the faint scent of ozone-burnt air like from a generator. The rangers she brought in with her confirmed the temperature near the vent was colder than the surrounding rock. Animals avoided the area entirely. A private firm volunteered to rescan the ridge using high-frequency radar. The results showed something the earlier maps had missed: a large cavity directly below the ledge, almost 30 meters wide, with another shaft descending beneath it. At the bottom were dense reflections, shaped roughly like human bodies. 3 of them spaced evenly apart. The county called off the work the next day. Too dangerous, they said. The files were sealed again, the project labeled suspended, but none of us stopped thinking about it. There's a certain silence that follows you home after a day like that, a silence that sticks to your clothes and rides in your truck like a passenger. Months later, a geology student cross-referenced our recordings with environmental noise reports from 6 years earlier. The frequency of the hum, 43.8 hertz, matched seismic data logged on August 10, 2019, the same weekend the Millers vanished. The reading had been dismissed back then as equipment error. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe no one ever will. But I can tell you this: the night we pulled that final report, the sound under the ridge stopped. For the first time in months, the valley was still. The wind carried only itself, and the trees stood quiet waiting. We thought it was over then, that whatever machine or echo had haunted that mountain was finally at rest. But when I drove back out 2 days later, just before sunrise, the ground felt different under my boots, lighter, somehow hollow. And as the first light touched the cliffs, a faint vibration came through the soles of my shoes, steady and patient, as if something deep beneath the earth had simply taken a breath and was beginning again. The ridge went quiet for only a few days. Then, just as the snow started dusting the treetops, the hum came back, same pitch, same rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. I remember standing by the truck that morning with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, staring out toward the line of pines where the sound seemed to rise from the ground itself. It was faint, but once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. It pulsed through your boots up the spine, a low vibration that didn't match anything natural. The forestry office ran tests on nearby logging generators, hydro lines, even underground aquifers. All of them came up clean. Whatever it was, it lived inside that mountain. Detective Duval called me that night, her voice low, like she didn't want to wake the dark around her. "I think it's running again," she said. "I want to see it before they shut us out for good." She'd already arranged another unofficial trip with the Missoula caving team, the same group that had found the concrete wall weeks earlier. I told her I'd come along. I didn't know what we'd find, but I couldn't stand the thought of sitting at home pretending it wasn't happening. We met before dawn. The air was sharp 28 degrees by my truck's gauge, frost coating the grass in silver. The team had 2 vans packed with equipment, thermal sensors, radar scanners, and a portable microphone rig meant for mining surveys. We hiked the last half mile in silence, flashlights swinging over the underbrush. The forest had that heavy quiet it gets right before sunrise when the sky is pale but the ground still feels asleep. By the time we reached the ridge, the hum had deepened. It wasn't just sound anymore. It felt physical, like the earth was breathing under your feet. Duval placed her palm on the rock face, her expression tight. "It's stronger," she whispered. We set up the gear near the old vent, threading a cable camera down through the pipe until it vanished into the dark. The screen flickered with static, then shapes, rough concrete flakes of paint curling like bark. At 70 feet, the image shifted, revealing a wide chamber and a slant of light coming from somewhere unseen. The paint on the wall was clearer this time, white block letters spelling out Federal Survey Project, 1973. Duval leaned closer to the monitor. "Property of who?" she murmured. None of the forestry archives listed that phrase. A private program may be something buried and forgotten. The camera drifted left, and for a moment I thought I saw something reflective glint near the bottom of the frame like glass or metal scattered unevenly. Before we could focus, the feed died. The line snapped clean, and the screen went black. The volunteers tried lowering another cable, but the hum began to spike, rattling the metal equipment cases. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't the machines. The sound had a pattern now, 3 pulses pause, 3 pulses repeating with surgical precision. One of the cavers, a quiet kid named Theo, looked up from the display. "That's Morse code," he said softly. None of us spoke after that. We just stood there listening, the cold air cutting through our jackets while the mountain spoke in code we couldn't answer. By dusk, the sound faded as abruptly as it had come. We packed the gear left markers near the fissure and hiked out. Duval didn't say much on the walk back, just kept glancing over her shoulder toward the ridge. When we reached the trailhead, she paused beside her truck and said, "You ever feel like the ground remembers things we've forgotten?" I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. 2 days later, the forestry department sealed the vent. They poured concrete over the opening, posted a warning sign about unstable rock. It felt final. But the night after the seal was set, the hum came through again, louder this time, echoing across the valley like a buried engine throttling up. I drove out alone that evening, parked by the service road, and shut off the headlights. The sound carried through the cold air, steady and deliberate. Then as I stepped out of the truck, I smelled something diesel, mixed with ozone, sharp and metallic. The trees around me were dead still, no wind, no birds. Only that vibration beneath the soil, like something deep below was trying to wake. Duval called a week later to say the lab had analyzed the last spectrogram. The pattern repeated every 15 seconds, 3 pulses, pause, 3 pulses. When slowed down, it matched SOS. She didn't tell the department. She just wrote it in her notes and underlined it twice. I think she was afraid of what it meant, because if that signal was real, someone or something had been calling for help from under that mountain for years. In early winter, the snow came heavy. The ridge vanished beneath drifts, the trees bent under ice. The hum persisted every night from midnight to dawn. Then, in late December, it stopped. No reason, no interference, no tremor. Just silence. For the first time since the tent was found, the valley slept. Duval said she felt relief. I felt the opposite. Silence has a way of making you hear everything you missed before. Even after the case was officially suspended, she kept visiting the site. Sometimes she'd call me from the trailhead just to talk. "Feels wrong to let it fade," she'd say. "We owe them more than that." By January, the snow had buried everything, the ledge, the vent, even the marker stakes we'd left behind. The tent sat boxed up in a warehouse in Helena, tagged as evidence, and the locket was returned to the Miller family's relatives. The last trace of the case was a single blue nylon strip half buried in snow near where the vent used to be. It matched the missing rainfly from the Miller's tent, the original, not the replacement. The cut along its seam looked too clean for weather. A few months later, the ridge thawed, and rangers doing spring cleanup found the same patch of ground where we'd worked. The soil was disturbed new dark, as if something had shifted underneath. They logged it as frost heaved the natural movement of water and ice. But when I went back to see it for myself, I noticed the shape, a small, perfect circle about the width of a manhole. The dirt around it was smooth, pressed down as if it had opened and closed again. I never told anyone about that. I just stood there watching the sunlight break across the valley and realized I could still feel that faint tremor in my boots so soft you'd think it was imagination. Maybe it was. But as I turned to leave, I heard a sound carried on the wind, a single hollow knock from somewhere far below. Then, nothing. That night I dreamed of the photographs, the last ones from the camera. Claire standing by the tent, the girls laughing by the creek, and that blurred figure in the background watching. Only this time the figure was facing the camera and I could see the reflection of blue nylon in its eyes. I woke before dawn, the hum still echoing in my ears, though the house was quiet. The official file on the Millers still lists them as missing. Every theory has its believers. Illegal mining government experiment, environmental accident, but none explain how a family vanished, how their tent reappeared newer than the day it was bought, or why a mountain in Flathead County hums like a heartbeat every time the air turns cold. In March, Theo, the same kid who'd recognized the Morse code, sent Duval one last email. He'd been reanalyzing the vent recordings from the week before the silence. There's something else, he wrote. Right before the last pulse, the pattern changes one long tone instead of three short. The recording ends, there a single sustained note that fades into static. When Duval played it for me, the sound filled the room low, unbroken, almost human, in the way it held breath. She shut it off after 30 seconds and stared at the wall. It's not just machinery, she said quietly. It's communication. I didn't argue. Some truths sit better unspoken. Outside, the evening was fading into that cold Montana blue, the kind that swallows everything between daylight and night. I remember looking toward the horizon, thinking how small the world feels when you realize parts of it are still unknown. And somewhere under that ridge, beneath layers of rock and time, something was still alive enough to send a signal. I keep a copy of the sound file on an old flash drive. Some nights when the wind's low and the world feels too quiet, I play it through my headphones. 3 short pulses pause, 3 short pulses and wait for the long one to follow. I tell myself it's just data noise trapped in a circuit. But deep down, I know it's a voice from somewhere we were never meant to hear. And I can't help but wonder if all those years ago the Millers heard it first. It's strange how the sound of a place can change after you've learned its secrets. That ridge above Flathead used to hum with something alive beneath it, steady, mechanical, unexplainable. Now, when I stand there, it's quiet. You'd think that would bring peace, but the silence carries its own kind of weight. It's the kind of silence that feels aware of you like the land itself is holding its breath. After the last signal was recorded, the one that ended with that long, unbroken tone, the official investigation was closed for good. The forestry department fenced off the ridge, citing safety concerns, and the county sealed the access road with a heavy steel gate. I was there the morning they welded it shut. Frost clung to the hinges, and when the flame hit the metal, it hissed like the mountain was sighing. No one spoke. We just watched the lock set in place, knowing we wouldn't be back. Detective Duval retired not long after. She said it was time that she'd done all she could, but I could tell it wasn't rest she was looking for, it was distance. We met for coffee once before she moved out of state. She brought the old field notebook, the one with her handwriting scrawled sideways in the margins. She turned to a page near the end where she'd written something in pencil and underlined it twice. It said, "They tried to call for help." Then she closed the book and said, "That's all I can live with." I didn't ask where she was headed, and she didn't say. Some truths, once spoken aloud, don't need repeating. Theo, the intern who'd found the Morse code, stayed on at the university. He ended up writing a research paper about anomalous subsonic frequencies in the northern Rockies. He sent me a copy, thick, technical, full of words I barely understood. But there was a paragraph near the end that stopped me cold. It said certain frequencies may not originate from geological activity, but from residual mechanical resonance associated with sealed man-made cavities. I read it twice, maybe 3 times, before closing the file. As for the Miller family, they were finally declared deceased that spring. There was a memorial held by the lake, a quiet one. Not many came, just a few relatives, some former students, and a handful of people like me who'd spent years searching for them. A pastor read a short prayer about still waters and hidden valleys. When it was over, we each set a white flower on the surface of the lake. The petals drifted apart slowly, some circling before sinking. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching the water ripple against the shore. The current was gentle, but it pulled everything toward the center before letting go. Afterward, I drove up to the overlook where you can see the ridge from a distance. Snow still lingered in the shaded crevices, and the wind was moving through the pines. I thought about the first time I saw that blue tent in the drone footage, the way it looked impossibly untouched, waiting for someone to come back. For years, I believed the forest had swallowed the millers whole, that they'd simply disappeared into the wild. But now I wonder if it was the opposite, that they'd stumbled into something man-made, something that was supposed to stay hidden, and the forest had been trying to give them back. The evidence is boxed up in Helena now, the tent, the locket, the camera battery sealed in plastic. Each item labeled and dated, each one a fragment of a life that never found its way home. I've gone through those boxes more times than I should admit. They're stored in a concrete room under humming lights, shelves lined with other unfinished stories. When you open the case file, the air smells faintly of paper and dust, like a library that's forgotten what silence means. Sometimes I think about the people who built whatever's under that ridge, the engineers, the survey teams, the ones who left before anyone started asking questions. Most of them would be gone by now, their records lost in some federal archive. No one checks anymore. But their machines are still there, running on borrowed time, pulsing just enough to remind the living that not everything buried stays still. I've come to believe the Millers didn't just find a place they shouldn't have. They found a piece of history no one wanted remembered. I don't pretend to understand what the hum really was. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not someone prone to wild theories. But I do know this: every recording we ever took carried the same pattern, beginning strong, fading slow, like a signal dying out. And the last one didn't fade. It stopped. That's what stays with me. You can feel it in your chest, that moment when a sound cuts off mid-beat, leaving your own pulse to finish what's missing. There's a plaque now near the trailhead, bronze weathered small enough you could miss it if you weren't looking. It reads, "In memory of Ethan Clare Lilly and June Miller. Lost to the mountains, remembered by those who searched." Beneath the names, someone etched a single line that wasn't part of the official design. Somewhere they called for help. No one knows who carved it. Every once in a while, hikers report hearing the hum again. They describe it like a truck idling far off, or the low thrum of a generator beneath the earth. It always happens at dawn or dusk, never in full daylight. The Forestry Service writes it off as acoustic illusion, temperature, inversion, echoes from distant machinery. Maybe they're right. But I've stood there myself long after the sun goes down, and I've felt that same vibration through the soles of my boots. It's not loud, not threatening. It's just steady, familiar, like a heartbeat you can't tell apart from your own. Life moves on in strange ways. Kalispell grew busier after the fires a few years back. New houses, more tourists, trails reopened under new names. Most people don't talk about the Millers anymore. When they do, it's in the way small towns speak of ghosts, kindly, quietly, with a shrug that says the living have to keep living. But sometimes late at night I'll hear that low wind outside my window and catch myself listening for something else. It's not fear anymore. It's recognition. Duval sent me a letter last year from somewhere down south. No return address. Inside was a single page torn from her old notebook, the one she used to carry on those long hikes. Written in her small, neat handwriting were just a few words. Silence doesn't mean gone. It means waiting. I keep it pinned above my desk. On the nights when sleep doesn't come easy, I read it once, then switch off the light. I've been asked more than once why I keep telling this story, why I don't let it rest like the mountain has. The truth is, some stories don't end just because the sound stops. They echo in the empty spaces we leave behind, the ones between memory and evidence, between faith and reason. Maybe it's human nature to need answers, or maybe it's enough to keep listening even when all you hear is silence. If you ever find yourself driving the back roads north of Flathead, there's a turnout just before the timber line. Park there and turn off your engine. Wait for the wind to die down. You might feel it the faintest vibration underfoot, too steady to be wind, too deep to be imagination. If you do, don't be afraid. Just listen. Somewhere in that hum is a family that never made it home, and the echo of a signal that crossed 6 years and 2,000 feet of stone trying to be heard. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for curiosity, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because remembering is the only way silence ever becomes peace.